"You're making a mistake," Danielle Brooks said, her voice low but steady, the kind of calm that didn't match the tension tightening around her as Officer Ryan Cole held her wrist just a little too firmly outside the courthouse steps. The late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the concrete as a small crowd slowed, then stopped, phones rising one by one, capturing a moment no one fully understood but everyone felt. Cole's jaw clenched as he glanced at the growing circle, his badge, catching the light, authority radiating from every inch of his posture. "Ma'am, keep your hands visible," he repeated, louder this time, as if volume could replace certainty. But Danielle didn't move the way people expected someone cornered to move. She didn't pull away, didn't argue, didn't plead. She simply stood there, shoulders relaxed, eyes clear, breathing even, like she had already stepped outside the panic everyone else was trapped in. The courthouse doors behind them swung open and shut with a dull rhythm. Suits passed by without stopping, a few glances lingering just long enough to judge, to assume, to decide she must have done something to deserve this, because scenes like this always needed a reason, and people were quick to invent one when they didn't have it. A second officer approached, hand hovering near his belt, not aggressive, just ready, reinforcing the imbalance that hung in the air like humidity before a storm. Danielle's gaze shifted briefly, not to the officers, not to the crowd, but to the flag above the courthouse steps as it moved gently in the wind, fabric brushing against itself with a soft, steady sound, grounding, constant. She took a slow breath in, then out, and when she spoke again it wasn't louder, just clearer. "You don't know who you're stopping," she said, not as a threat, not even as a warning, but as a fact placed gently into the space between them. Cole's grip tightened for a fraction of a second, a flicker of irritation crossing his face, the kind that came when control felt challenged in a way he couldn't quite name. "That's not for you to decide," he replied, though his eyes shifted, just briefly, scanning the perimeter as the murmur of the crowd thickened. Someone whispered, someone else chuckled nervously, the energy turning, not yet hostile, but charged, uncertain. The air felt heavier now, like something unseen was approaching. Danielle remained still, her hands open at her sides, palms visible, her posture unchanged, but there was something in the way she stood that didn't match the narrative forming around her, something that didn't fit the role people were assigning her. And for a moment, just a moment, even Cole seemed to feel it, a pause too small to notice unless you were looking for it. The distant sound of engines rolled in, low at first, then growing, echoing off the stone facade of the courthouse, a subtle shift, almost easy to ignore. But Danielle's eyes moved toward the street before anyone else reacted, her expression unchanged, as if she had been expecting exactly that sound all along. The sound grew louder, engines rolling closer, not fast, not frantic, but deliberate, controlled, the kind of movement that did not ask for attention yet commanded it anyway. And one by one the heads in the crowd began to turn, the low murmur thinning into a stretched silence as 3 black SUVs came into view at the edge of the courthouse drive, their glossy surfaces reflecting the late afternoon light like dark mirrors. Danielle did not shift her stance, but her eyes followed them with quiet recognition, while Officer Cole's grip remained firm though his focus flickered, just slightly, toward the approaching vehicles, uncertainty threading into the edges of his control. The second officer glanced over his shoulder, then back at Danielle, as if recalculating something he could not yet name. The SUV slowed in perfect alignment, tires whispering against the pavement before stopping with a precision that felt practiced, rehearsed. Doors did not slam open. They opened smoothly, almost silently, and from within stepped individuals in dark suits, their posture straight, their movements unhurried yet exact, the kind of presence that did not need to announce itself because it carried its own weight. The air shifted again, not louder, but heavier, as if the space itself recognized a change in authority before anyone spoke. Danielle exhaled softly, her shoulders still relaxed, her hands still open, and for the first time since the moment began, her gaze moved directly back to Officer Cole, not defiant, not fearful, simply steady. Cole felt it, the subtle reversal in the air, the way the crowd leaned back instead of forward, the way phones lowered just slightly, attention redirecting toward the new arrivals. One of the suited figures stepped ahead of the others, his shoes striking the pavement with a measured rhythm. Each step closing the distance without urgency yet without hesitation. He did not look at the crowd, did not acknowledge the cameras. His focus fixed forward until he stood just a few feet away, his presence cutting through the noise that had lingered moments before. Cole straightened instinctively, his grip loosening by a fraction though he did not release her. Not yet. The man's voice, when it came, was not raised, but it carried, clear and precise. "Officer," he said, and that single word shifted everything. Not a command, not a question, but something in between, something that expected to be answered. Cole hesitated, just long enough for the silence to deepen, for the weight of the moment to settle into every set of eyes watching. Danielle remained still, her breathing even, her expression unchanged, but the space around her no longer felt like a corner. It felt like a line that had been drawn and was about to be crossed. The second officer stepped back half a step without realizing it, his hand lowering slightly. The crowd now completely silent. No whispers, no movement. Only the faint sound of the flag above brushing in the wind and the distant hum of the city beyond the courthouse steps. The suited man's gaze shifted from Cole to Danielle, a brief, acknowledging look that lasted less than a second but carried recognition. And in that moment, something invisible but undeniable settled into place, like the final piece of a structure locking in. Cole's fingers finally loosened enough to release the pressure on her wrist, though his hand still hovered, caught between holding on and letting go, unsure which choice still belonged to him. The silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable, the kind that made people aware of their own breathing, their own presence, as if everyone standing on those courthouse steps suddenly realized they were witnessing something that was no longer ordinary. The suited man took one more step forward, close enough now that the distance between him and Officer Cole felt symbolic rather than physical, his gaze steady, unwavering. "Release her," he said, not louder than before, but this time there was no space left for interpretation, no room for hesitation. Cole's jaw tightened as his hand finally pulled away completely, the absence of pressure immediate, noticeable. Danielle's wrist lowered slowly, not rushed, not reactive, just controlled, as if she had never been restrained at all. The second officer shifted his weight, glancing between Cole and the man in the suit, uncertainty now fully visible in the way his posture softened. The crowd leaned in without moving, eyes wide, phones still, waiting. The suited man turned slightly, revealing the small, polished badge clipped at his waist, subtle, almost hidden, but unmistakable to those who knew what to look for. And suddenly the air changed again, not tense, not uncertain, but resolved. Cole's shoulders straightened, though the confidence that once filled them no longer held the same shape. "Sir," he began, his voice lower now, measured. "We were responding to a report, but the explanation felt thinner than it should have, like words spoken out of habit rather than conviction." The man in the suit did not interrupt, did not react. He simply listened, and somehow that made the silence heavier than any argument could have. Danielle adjusted her sleeve slightly, a small, almost invisible movement, her composure untouched, her breathing still even, her eyes calm as they moved briefly across the faces in the crowd, not searching for support, not acknowledging judgment, just seeing, observing, present. The suited man finally spoke again, his tone unchanged. "And now you are standing down," he said, not as a suggestion, not as a correction, but as a conclusion already reached. Cole hesitated for the briefest moment, then nodded once, a controlled motion, his authority shifting into something quieter, something contained. The second officer stepped back fully this time, creating space where there had been none. The crowd exhaled almost in unison, a collective release that no one had realized they were holding. One of the other suited agents moved to stand just behind Danielle, not touching, not guiding, simply present. A silent assurance rather than an action. Danielle lifted her chin slightly, her posture unchanged, but her presence now undeniable, no longer framed by the narrative the crowd had built around her, but by something deeper, something that had been there from the beginning. The suited man looked at her directly now, his expression respectful, certain. "Ms. Brooks," he said, and the way he spoke her name carried weight, recognition, history. the kind that could not be faked or mistaken, and in that single moment, every assumption hanging in the air quietly collapsed, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with the quiet certainty of truth taking its place. The name lingered in the air longer than expected, Ms. Brooks, spoken with a precision that erased every assumption that had filled the space just moments ago. Danielle met his gaze without surprise, without relief, only acknowledgement, as if this moment had always been inevitable. The suited man gave a slight nod, a gesture small in motion but heavy in meaning. "We have been looking for you," he said quietly, not for the crowd, not for the officers, only for her, and that single sentence shifted the ground beneath everyone listening. Officer Cole's expression tightened, not in anger, but in realization, the kind that arrives too late to change what has already been done. "Looking for her," he repeated under his breath, as if testing the weight of the words, trying to fit them into the version of reality he had built just minutes before, but it no longer aligned. Danielle lowered her hand fully to her side, her posture still composed, still measured, the faint mark on her wrist already fading into something insignificant compared to what now stood in front of her. One of the agents behind her stepped slightly to the side, creating a clear path toward the courthouse entrance, not directing her, not urging her, simply making space, the kind of space that had not existed before. The crowd remained silent, but their attention had changed, no longer curious, no longer judgmental. Now it was something closer to respect, mixed with uncertainty, as if they were recalibrating everything they thought they understood about the scene they had just witnessed. The suited man continued, his voice steady. "Your presence is required inside," he said, each word deliberate, formal, yet carrying an undercurrent of urgency that did not need to be emphasized. Danielle glanced briefly toward the courthouse doors, the same doors she had walked through countless times without notice, without recognition, and for a moment the reflection in the glass showed her standing not as she had been seen before, but as she truly was, composed, grounded, undeniable. Officer Cole stepped back fully now, the distance between them no longer contested, his authority replaced by something quieter, something that did not speak, but was felt. He cleared his throat, searching for words that no longer seemed to fit. "Ma'am," he began, but stopped, the title insufficient, the tone misplaced. Danielle did not respond, not out of dismissal, but because there was nothing left to say in that direction. Her focus had already shifted forward. The suited man moved slightly to her side, not leading, not following, simply aligned. "They are waiting," he added, softer this time. And that was enough. Danielle took her first step forward, measured, unhurried, the sound of her shoes against the concrete echoing faintly in the stillness. Each step carrying her away from the version of herself the crowd had created and toward the truth that had been hidden in plain sight. The courthouse doors opened as she approached, not dramatically, not suddenly, just enough to allow her through, and as she crossed the threshold, the light shifted, the noise of the outside world fading behind her, leaving only the quiet certainty of what was about to unfold inside, a certainty that no one outside could yet fully understand. The moment Danielle stepped inside, the temperature seemed to drop, not cold, but controlled, the kind of air that carried quiet authority. The courthouse lobby stretched wide with polished marble floors reflecting the overhead lights in soft, muted tones, every footstep echoing just enough to remind you that every movement here mattered. The doors closed behind her with a gentle sound that felt louder than it was, sealing off the noise, the judgment, the assumptions left outside. The suited man walked beside her, his pace matching hers exactly, not ahead, not behind, aligned. "They moved the hearing up," he said calmly, his voice low but clear. Danielle nodded once, her expression unchanged, as if the adjustment did not surprise her, as if she had already accounted for it long before she arrived. Down the corridor, a set of double doors stood slightly ajar, guarded not by force, but by presence. Two individuals in similar attire stood at either side, their posture straight, eyes focused, the kind of stillness that spoke louder than movement. As Danielle approached, they stepped aside without a word, not because they were told to, but because they recognized her, the subtle shift in their stance marking the difference between protocol and respect. Inside, The room was already full, not crowded, but deliberate, every seat occupied by people who understood the weight of why they were there. Legal teams, officials, observers, all turned slightly as she entered, not in curiosity, but in acknowledgement, a quiet ripple that moved across the room and then settled. Danielle paused just inside the doorway for a fraction of a second, taking in the space, the arrangement, the tension that hung just beneath the surface like a held breath. Her eyes moved across the room, not searching, but confirming, details aligning exactly as expected. The suited man leaned slightly closer. "They have been waiting for your statement," he said, and there was something in his tone. Not urgency, not pressure, but recognition of the moment that was about to unfold. Danielle stepped forward, her movement steady, unhurried, each step measured against the silence that followed her. At the far end of the room, a long table stood beneath the seal of the court, and behind it, figures who had once seemed distant, untouchable, now watched her approach with a different kind of attention, not dismissive, not skeptical, but careful, as if aware that whatever came next would not be easily undone. One of the officials adjusted his posture, papers in front of him shifting slightly, a small sound in an otherwise still room. Danielle reached the table and placed her hand lightly against its surface, not to steady herself, but to mark her place, her presence. The room seemed to hold its breath again. Waiting, the suited man stepped back just enough to give her space, his role complete for now. And in that quiet, suspended moment, every eye in the room fixed on Danielle Brooks, no longer a figure on the edge of someone else's story, but the center of something much larger, something that had already begun long before anyone outside had noticed and was only now about to be revealed. The room did not move, but something inside it shifted, subtle and undeniable, like the moment before a storm decides its direction. Danielle's fingers rested lightly against the edge of the table, not gripping, not trembling, just present, grounded. Her eyes lifted slowly to meet the panel before her, one by one, not in challenge, not in hesitation, but in quiet acknowledgement, as if she already understood each of them before they spoke a single word. A man at the center adjusted his glasses. The faint sound of paper sliding against wood breaking the silence for a fraction of a second before it settled again. "Ms. Brooks," he began, his voice measured, careful. "You understand the significance of this proceeding." Danielle did not answer immediately, not because she was unsure, but because she chose her timing with precision, her breath steady, her posture unchanged. The faint hum of the building's ventilation system filled the background like a distant current, constant, almost invisible. "I do," she said finally, her voice calm, clear, carrying through the room without effort, no strain, no force, just certainty. A few heads shifted slightly, not in disagreement, but in recognition of something they had not expected, the kind of presence that did not need to raise itself to be heard. The man nodded once, but his eyes remained fixed on her, studying, recalibrating. "Then you also understand what is at stake," he added, and this time there was a slight weight behind the words, not pressure, but gravity. Danielle's gaze did not waver. "What is at stake has been clear for a long time," she replied, her tone unchanged, and the simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any explanation could have. A quiet ripple moved through the room, not sound, but awareness, the kind that passes between people when something shifts beyond language. One of the officials leaned forward slightly, elbows resting against the table, as if drawn in despite himself. Danielle's hand lifted from the surface, not abruptly, just enough to rest at her side again. A small movement, but it marked a transition. She was no longer arriving, no longer preparing. She was now exactly where she needed to be. The suited man who had escorted her stood near the wall, still, observant, his presence no longer active but still essential, like a line drawn behind her that would not be crossed again. Danielle took a slow breath in, the kind that settles into the chest and anchors everything that follows. And when she spoke again, her voice carried not just through the room, but into it, filling the spaces between the people, the walls, the expectations that had been built long before she stepped inside. "You have been looking at the wrong picture," she said, not accusing, not defensive, just stating what had already been true. The words landed quietly, But they did not disappear. They stayed, suspended, forcing attention without demanding it. The man at the center paused, his hand hovering over the documents in front of him, as if unsure whether they still held the same meaning they had moments before. No one interrupted, no one redirected. The room had entered a different kind of silence now, one that did not wait to speak, but waited to understand. Danielle's eyes moved once more across the panel, not searching for approval, not seeking permission, just ensuring that every word she would say next would be seen, heard, and remembered exactly as intended. The words settled into the room like a quiet weight, not loud enough to disrupt, but heavy enough that no one could ignore them. You have been looking at the wrong picture. The man at the center leaned back slightly, his fingers pressing together as if trying to hold onto the version of events that was already beginning to slip. Then help us understand the right one, he said, his tone controlled, but no longer leading. Danielle did not rush to answer. Her gaze lowered briefly to the documents. Spread across the table, pages filled with conclusions that had been built without her voice, without her presence. And for a moment, the silence returned, but it was different now, no longer empty. Now it carried expectation. Danielle reached forward and gently turned one of the pages toward herself, her movements precise, familiar, as if she had seen this exact layout before, not just once, but many times. Her fingertips brushed the margin, tracing a line that no one else had noticed. This report, she said softly, is based on a sequence that never actually happened. A few heads lifted at that, not in disbelief, but in recalculation, the kind that begins quietly before it changes everything. The man's eyes narrowed slightly, not in resistance, but in focus. That is a strong claim, he replied. Danielle nodded once, acknowledging the weight of what she had said. It is also a verifiable one, she answered, her voice steady, unwavering. She shifted the document slightly, aligning it with another file on the table, one that had been overlooked, untouched, the difference between them subtle at first glance, but undeniable once seen. You built your timeline from this, she continued, her finger resting lightly on the page. But this version was incomplete before it was ever filed. The room leaned in without moving, attention tightening, the kind that narrows the world down to a single point. The man reached forward, his hand hovering before finally pulling the imperceptible, but real. Danielle watched him, not with satisfaction, not with urgency, just with the quiet certainty of someone who already knew what he would find. Cross-reference the submission logs, she added, her voice still calm, still measured. You will see that key entries were removed before review. A soft sound came from the far end of the table as another official began flipping through pages, faster now, searching, confirming, the tension in the room tightening again, but this time it was not directed at her. It was directed inward, toward the system itself, toward the assumptions that had been accepted without question. The man at the center exhaled slowly, his hand resting flat against the document as if grounding himself in the realization unfolding in front of him. If this is accurate, he said, his voice quieter now, then the entire basis shifts. Danielle met his gaze again, steady, composed. It already has, she replied, and there was no emphasis in her tone, no need for it, because the truth of it had already begun to move through the room, reshaping it piece by piece. The suited man near the wall remained still, but his eyes followed every exchange, every subtle shift, recognizing what others were only just beginning to see, that this was not a correction, not a clarification, this was a reversal, and it had been waiting, quietly, for the right moment to surface. The shift did not explode, it settled, slow and undeniable, like a truth finally allowed to breathe. Papers moved now, not randomly, but with purpose, hands that had once rested in certainty, now turning pages with quiet urgency. The man at the center straightened, his earlier authority no longer rigid but recalibrated. Run the submission logs again, he said, not to Danielle, but to the room. And this time there was no hesitation in the response. One of the officials nodded quickly, fingers already moving across a tablet, the faint tapping sound breaking the silence in a steady rhythm. Danielle stepped back half a pace, not retreating, but giving the moment space to unfold without her needing to push it further. Her presence remained steady, grounded, the anchor point in a room that was now shifting around her. The suited man by the wall watched closely, arms relaxed at his sides, his gaze moving from the panel to Danielle and back again. Understanding that the balance had already tipped, the rest was only catching up. A screen at the far end flickered to life, data populating line by line, timestamps, revisions, gaps that had once been invisible now highlighted in stark clarity. One of the officials leaned forward, his voice low but edged with realization. "There are missing entries," he said, not as a question, not as speculation, but as confirmation. Another voice followed, quieter, more careful. "They were removed before review," echoing Danielle's earlier words, but now carrying the weight of evidence behind them. The man at the center exhaled slowly, his hand pressing against the table as if steadying the shift beneath him. His eyes lifted to Danielle again, no longer measuring her, no longer questioning, but recognizing. "Why were you not included in the initial review?" he asked, and this time the question was not accusatory. It was searching. Danielle's expression did not change, but something in her gaze softened, not with emotion, but with clarity. "Because the version you received was never meant to include me," she answered, simple, direct, the truth laid out without embellishment. A quiet tension moved through the room again, but it was different now, no longer directed at her, but at the absence she had just defined. The man nodded slowly, the realization settling deeper. "Then we have been operating on a controlled narrative," he said, more to himself than anyone else. Danielle did not respond immediately. She let the words exist, let them take shape in the minds around her, before adding, "You were operating on what you were given," she said, her tone even, not accusatory, not forgiving, just factual. The distinction mattered, and it landed. The officials exchanged brief glances, not defensive, but aware, the kind of awareness that comes when responsibility shifts from assumption to understanding. The man at the center straightened fully now, his posture no longer uncertain, but deliberate. "This proceeding is no longer based on the original submission," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "We will reassess all findings effective immediately." The statement did not raise in volume, but it changed everything. The room responded in silence, but it was not empty. It was full of movement beneath the surface, decisions forming, directions changing. Danielle remained still, her role in this moment complete without needing to claim it. The suited man near the wall gave the slightest nod, almost imperceptible, but it marked the end of something that had begun long before this room. And as the officials turned back to their documents, no longer as fixed conclusions, but as questions to be answered again, the truth Danielle had carried quietly now stood at the center, no longer hidden, no longer ignored, but impossible to set aside. The room did not erupt into noise. It settled into something quieter, something heavier, like a truth that had finally found its place and no longer needed to fight for attention. The officials moved with purpose now, but without urgency, their actions measured, deliberate, as if each motion carried weight beyond the moment. Danielle stepped back from the table, her role no longer at the center, but her presence still anchoring everything that had shifted. The man at the center gave a small nod. Not formal, not performative, just acknowledgement, the kind that did not need to be spoken aloud to be understood. "Ms. Brooks," he said, softer now. "Thank you." The words were simple, but they carried a different kind of authority, one rooted not in position, but in recognition. Danielle inclined her head slightly, accepting without holding on to it. Her gaze moved once more across the room, not searching, not questioning, just seeing the change that had taken place, the documents that once defined the narrative now lay open, no longer conclusions, but beginnings. The suited man near the wall stepped forward just enough to align with her again, his presence quiet, steady. "You are clear to go," he said, his tone even, not dismissing the moment, but closing it with precision. Danielle turned toward the exit, her steps the same as before, unhurried, grounded, each one carrying her forward without needing to look back. The double doors opened as she approached, the hallway beyond stretching out in calm, controlled silence, the kind that follows resolution, not chaos. Behind her, the room continued to move, voices low, decisions forming, but none of it reached her, Not anymore. As she stepped into the corridor, the sound of her footsteps echoed softly against the marble. Steady, consistent, a rhythm that matched her breath. The suited man walked beside her for a few steps, then slowed, allowing her to continue ahead on her own, not because she needed distance, but because she no longer needed support. Danielle reached the main doors and pushed them open, the outside light spilling in, warm, natural, untouched by what had just unfolded inside. The crowd that had gathered earlier had thinned, but a few remained, their eyes turning toward her as she stepped out. Not with curiosity now, not with judgment, but with something quieter, something closer to respect. Across the steps, Officer Cole stood near the edge of the walkway, his posture still, his expression unreadable at first glance. But as Danielle passed, his gaze lowered slightly, not out of defeat, but out of understanding, the kind that arrives when certainty is replaced by truth. Danielle did not stop, did not pause. She walked past him with the same calm she had carried from the beginning, the same steady presence that had never changed. The flag above the courthouse moved gently in the breeze, its sound soft, constant, and as Danielle descended the steps, the city beyond continued as it always had, unaware of the shift that had just taken place. But for those who had witnessed it, for those who had felt it, something remained, not loud, not visible, but undeniable, a quiet line drawn between what had been assumed and what had been revealed. And in that space, Danielle Brooks walked forward, not as someone who had been proven right, but as someone who had never needed to be anything else.